My purpose this morning is to demonstrate that Mathew Franklin Whittier, who was myself in the 19th century, may have been an obscure author, and that was largely by choice because he kept anonymous, but he was a respected author. He was respected by his peers. I also want to demonstrate how badly the John Greenleaf Whittier historians have marginalized Mathew. Mathew, of course, was John Greenleaf Whittier's younger brother. Now, recently, my last video entry, a troll had objections about my methodology, shall we say, to put it politely. And I typically delete the comments of trolls. I don't get very many comments, but if a troll comments using sophistry, I delete it. I did go into it in depth and analyzed it in my written blog just for fun. But I think part of the reason is that I can't give all my evidence in these video blogs. That's just too much of it. So sometimes when I'm focusing on a particular topic, I'll give the hard evidence for that topic. And then when there's background information, I will just bring that in and assert it. And I'm asserting it based on a great deal of evidence, but I can't bring in all the evidence for that. But this time, I think I'm going to try to stick to just everything I can prove. Everything I'm going to say today, I've got in black and white in historical sources, and I can prove. Of course, there's always background to that. You know, there's things behind that and things behind that. And we'd be here all day if I tracked down every single one of those. Over 13 years, I did methodically and rigorously track down all of those things. So let's see, we have to build a case here. This is like a legal case, and we're going to build a case. And the first thing I want to establish is that Mathew was a brilliant conversationalist. So we're going to look in Whittier at Close Range by Francis Campbell Sparhawk. This is one of the John Greenleaf Whittier biographies that I used in the course of my research. And let's see, we're looking at page 28. Now, this writer starts out saying a relative of the Whittiers and not identifying her. This is Elizabeth Whittier, Mathew Franklin Whittier's daughter, who was John Greenleaf Whittier's niece and who lived with him for many years, grew up in his household. And that's who she's talking to, and she admits it at the bottom. She just doesn't tie it together. So I'm going to read this little paragraph. A relative of the Whittiers, and at one time in the poet's family, that's Elizabeth, has spoken to the writer of the brightness and wit of Franklin. Now, Mathew's middle name was Franklin. In the family, they called him Franklin, but he didn't go by Franklin in later life. The Whittier biographers have a wonderful time calling him Franklin and thinking that he liked to be called Frank. Well, he hated being called Frank. That's what I feel. Here we're in something that's difficult to prove. But I know that his friend, John Townsend Trowbridge, called him Matt, and, lots of other people apparently called him Matt or Mathew. Anyway, they speak of him as Franklin. So I'll start at the beginning. A relative of the Whittiers, and at one time in the poet's family, has spoken to the writer of the brightness and wit of Franklin, himself also a writer, although under an assumed name, and of the brilliant conversation of the two men as they sat together in the garden room, their reminiscences and familiar talk interrupted by peals of laughter. For the poet, who showed chiefly his grave side to the world, had in him a rich vein of humor, and his friends and neighbors knew that it never gave out through want of being worked. Franklin's daughter, her aunt's namesake, lived with the poet from early girlhood until her marriage. Well, they've now admitted who it is they're talking about, who the story came from. Now, note that, here they're having a conversation, brilliant conversation, and Mathew was also a writer, okay? And he wrote under an assumed name. He actually wrote under possibly hundreds of assumed names that they didn't even know about. And she immediately goes to John Greenleaf Whittier's sense of humor, even though Mathew was the humorist of the two, see? So this is all about John Greenleaf Whittier, but the truth is that Mathew was the one with a sense of humor. Mathew was the one who laughed, and Mathew was a brilliant conversationalist. Now, to emphasize this, we're going to go to Whittierland by Samuel T. Picard. Now, Samuel Picard was the official Whittier biographer. He was Elizabeth Whittier's husband, And I have determined that he was probably Mathew Franklin Whittier's nemesis from before Samuel married Lizzie. See, there again, there's something I would have to go back in and find evidence for. So it's difficult to prove everything in the middle of a video. But here is Picard's description of John Greenleaf Whittier with regard to humor. I never heard him laugh aloud, but a merrier face and an eye that twinkled with livelier glee when thoroughly amused are not often seen. He would double up with mirth without uttering a sound, his chuckle being visible instead of audible. But this peculiar expression of jollity was irresistibly infectious, and so on. So, according to Picard, the official Whittier biographer, he never laughed out loud. Whereas we have Sparhawk being told by Matthew's daughter that there would be peals of laughter when Mathew visited. See, so you get a sense. All I want to establish is that Mathew was a humorist and he was a brilliant conversationalist. Okay, so now we're going to back up a little bit. Let's see, where do I want to go? We're going to look at quails. Now, I've told you that I have absolutely proved that Mathew Franklin Whittier was the author writing travelogues as quails in the Boston Weekly Museum. Here we have the Boston Weekly Museum. And I've shown you the proof for that in either the last or the one right before that video blog entry. I caught him red-handed. So definitely quails is Mathew Franklin Whittier. So what I want to show you is that when Quails was in Europe, he made a tour of Europe. This was not Ashendage, as the historians believe, and he visited with Victor Hugo. Okay, so I just want to give you an idea of the caliber of writers that Mathew was friends with and would associate with. Victor Hugo is a man whose wonderful genius is stamped upon his face. Every lineament of his countenance is expressive of thought and nobleness of soul, and we have seldom spent an evening to so much advantage to ourselves as the one passed at the house of this poet, orator, and statesman. Okay, so now we definitely have, I can prove this right down the line, we have Mathew Franklin Whittier visiting with Victor Hugo in his home in Paris. Okay, that's all I wanted to get out of that. Now, we're going to see what Mathew Franklin Whittier had to say about William Makepeace Thackeray. This, of course, is one of Charles Dickens's close friends in that same close circle. Now, Thackeray wrote in a similar vein to Mathew, satire, humor, and so on, and it's entirely plausible that they could be friends on that basis. I also know that Mathew was friends with Oliver Wendell Holmes, who wrote a similar kind of work. So here we have Caleb Leathers. His column is called Chips and Porridge. This is in the Portland Transcript. This is the Portland Transcript, 1854, 1855. And we are in the March 3rd, 1855 edition of the Portland Transcript. I'm absolutely certain that Caleb Leathers is Mathew Franklin Whittier. He's philosophical, he's insightful and humorous, and so on. I mean, I went to a lot of trouble to nail this down and be absolutely certain that that's who we're talking about, and I'm absolutely certain. Again, I can't go into all the proof that Mathew Franklin Whittier was writing as Caleb Leathers. But here we have an entire 2.5 columns praising William Makepeace Thackeray. So in 1855, we now have Mathew Franklin Whittier praising William Makepeace Thackeray. I'll read you a little bit of it. It begins, Thackeray is the baldest novelist in the world. He don't idealize nor sentimentalize one particle, but shows up his characters just as they are. The judgment seat before which he calls them knows no favoritism, but awards equal and exact justice. They cannot, with any amount of finesse, elude the light that beams from the tribunal he erects. And then we'll go forward a little more. A very honest man is Mr. Thackeray. His very style proclaims his integrity, perspicuous, terse, every word abounding with meaning, and ornate only when the subject demands ornament. His words smite hard and ring like the purest metal. His dialogue is perfectly natural. All of his characters use such language as befits their degree of culture and natural capacity. His dialogue is exceedingly lifelike, nothing stilted about it. Men and women, I repeat, are made to appear as they are. It requires no little artistic skill to make an interesting book out of such everyday materials. But this Thackeray does. To him, therefore, let the high honor be accorded. He holds out no false issues. Life's plain, unvarnished realities only invite in his pages. Plain goodness, justice, and truth are only made attractive by him. This is very high praise. And when Mathew praised someone, he generally projected his own ideals onto the person. I mean, it may have been justified, but he would extol those things that he most highly valued in himself. And here we have the things that Mathew valued in himself and also in his writing. And one of the things he values is crisp writing. That's what he values in Thackeray, and that's something that he valued himself. I have other evidence for that. And I mentioned the last time, in the last video entry, that when Mathew originally wrote the introduction to A Christmas Carol, he wrote it crisply. And then if you look at Dickens' handwritten draft, you'll see that he puffed it out unnecessarily. He did that throughout the entire story. Anyway, so here we have definitely Mathew Franklin Whittier praising William Makepeace Thackeray. And you'll see why that's relevant in just a minute. Now, we're going to another Whittier biographer. This is Francis H. Underwood, and this is called John Greenleaf Whittier, a biography. It's published in 1884. Now, remember that Mathew died in January of 1883, the previous year. Now, on page 292, where he's talking about friendships, he says, here is a story from a Western periodical, purporting to have been written by its well-informed correspondent in New York. He's being sarcastic. It is sufficiently worthless in itself, but it may serve one good purpose. And then he tells a story supposedly about John Greenleaf Whittier having dinner with William Makepeace Thackeray, which he assumes is entirely apocryphal. And I'm going to read that story in a minute because I've got the original source for it. But I want to read his commentary here. Now, he's assuming that Mathew Franklin Whittier is a liar. He's assuming that the story can't possibly be true. And it doesn't cross his mind for a second, a fraction of a second, that this story could actually be about Mathew Franklin Whittier. Because who's Mathew Franklin Whittier that he would ever have dinner with William Makepeace Thackeray? See, that's how they marginalize Mathew Franklin Whittier in the Whittier legacy. And they don't mean to be cruel, but this is the line of BS that they were fed by Samuel Picard, who was Mathew's nemesis and who was in charge of the entire Whittier legacy, and I think who probably married Mathew's daughter specifically so he could get his hands on that legacy. Anyway, so I'll read the story in a minute, and I'll read it from the original source because there's a couple little differences. For one thing, in the original source, he says John H. Whittier, so Mr. Underwood has changed it to John G. Whittier without mentioning that that was a mistake. He says, after the story's given, it is sad to think of Thackeray as such a toper, but what has the ordinary reader to say concerning a circumstantial account like this, and by one with such an evident knowledge of the customs of London clubs? It is, quote, from a friend of Whittier's brother, too, and so is authentic. Now, you see what's going on here? That's sarcastic. It means that he thinks that Whittier is entirely unreliable. Mathew is entirely unreliable and is a liar. So he's sarcastically calling Mathew a liar. It is, quote, from a friend of Whittier's brother, too, and so is authentic. In other words, that's not just because it's secondhand. That's because it's John Greenleaf Whittier's brother, who we all know is a scoundrel and a liar and unreliable. And he says, if Thackeray had been helped into his carriage by his, quote, valet, that, of course, was proof positive. And to be hugged by a great strapping Englishman in a maudlin and slobbery way No wonder the staid Quaker resolved to have nothing more to do with him. The more because Whittier drinks no wine and never did, having been all his life a total abstainer. That's actually not true. I've got proof in John Greenleaf Whittier's letters that he drank when he had a cold as medicine. He is also averse to late hours and club dinners, and eats sparingly at midday as his ancestors did. One is quite sure he was never out of his bed, quote, when morning crept on. He has always been averse, likewise, to playing the lion, meaning allowing people to celebrate him publicly, even in our small city of Boston, and he has generally fled from any public demonstration. There is a further difficulty. He could not well have dined at a swell club in London with Thackeray, because he was never in that city, and never crossed the Atlantic. Finally, he lately assured the present writer that he had never, quote, met Thackeray anywhere, and had never even seen him, even though Thackeray did come and give a tour in America. So the story vanishes like a guilty ghost. Of such trustworthy materials are many biographies composed. Now, I want to say that there are times when I was under a mistaken impression about something, and I even waxed sarcastic about it, and later I sheepishly had to admit that I had been wrong. So nothing against Mr. Underwood, it just doesn't even occur to him that Mathew Franklin Whittier, the shiftless nobody, black sheep brother, of the Whittier family, could ever have been a colleague of William Makepeace Thackeray and could ever have dined with him and, went to Europe and all of these things. Well, that's exactly what happened because he did it as Quails. We've seen that he visited Victor Hugo. I know he was in London. And I know that they had a very similar writing style. And I know that in 1855, Mathew went at great lengths to praise William Makepeace Thackeray, as we have seen. And we know that he was a brilliant conversationalist because his own daughter, Elizabeth, said so. And we know that he was able to make even his brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, break out in peals of laughter when normally he didn't laugh out loud at all, according to Samuel Picard. You see how all these things fit together, right? Now, we're going to go to the original source of this story, which is the Cleveland Leader, February 5, 1883. Now remember, Mathew died in January of 1883. So the reason this story has come out now is because Mathew has recently died, and some friend of Mathew's that Mathew had told the story to in private has gone public with it somehow or other. And this is important because we now know that Mathew told his close friends some of these things that I've discovered in the deep historical record. He told somebody that he was in London, that he went to Europe. He told somebody that he met Thackeray. See, now we don't know who it is. And typically, I think Mathew would say, keep this under your hat. So most of these stories didn't leak out, but he did tell his close friends these things. All right, so I'm going to read this now. This is from a photocopy from the actual microfilm. How Whittier Treated Thackeray. Now that I am talking of literary men, I want to repeat a good story which was told me the other day of the little quarrel which John H. Whittier had with Thackeray, the great English novelist. Now, you know how stories go from one person to another and get distorted in the telling. So this story, originally about how Mathew met Thackeray, has now become a story about how his famous brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, met Thackeray. And that's because nobody's interested in Mathew, but they are very interested in stories about John Greenleaf Whittier, So that's what this has become. Whittier, as you know, is very reserved, and the story comes through a friend of his brother for the first time to the public. They don't even mention Mathew's name. This is typical. He's always the brother of the poet. Okay, so here again, he's the brother. When Mr. Whittier was in London years ago, he was made a lion by the literary people of the metropolis. The father of Pendennis and Becky Sharp was prominent among his entertainers, and among other things, he honored him by a dinner at his club. Whittier and Thackeray went together in Thackeray's carriage to the club rooms. At the dinner, much wine was drunk, as is the custom at all such feasts in England. Thackeray seemed to have no limit to his capacity in this direction, and drank bottle after bottle. I think that's kind of unlikely. I could be wrong, but, even a seasoned alcoholic can't drink several bottles, I think, at one sitting. Apparently without being in the least affected by it. He was as witty and clear-headed as though he had been taking nothing but soda. Whittier was temperate and drank but little. As morning crept on, however, and the feast was ended, Thackeray succumbed, and, on leaving, his valet had to carry him to the carriage. On the way home he became maudlin and threw his arms around Whittier's neck, vowing eternal friendship. In short, he acted so that Whittier grew thoroughly disgusted and left, resolving to have nothing more to do with Thackeray. And you've also already heard Underwood's objections, historical objections. Well, this story's been distorted. And Mathew's take on it, it would have been amusing to him. He loved stories from real life, anecdotes from real life. And it would have been amusing to him, because Thackeray held his liquor so well and then lost it at the end. Mathew was a temperance man. I think he would have had a few sips just to be polite, which is what we're seeing here. But vowing eternal friendship, that was not just the wine. That was because they were very much of like mind. They were colleagues, and Thackeray was treating him as a personal friend and a colleague. Okay, so I think it's just a piece of the puzzle, and it just shows you that Whittier is not really, again, he's obscure, but he's not a minor author. See, he's a colleague and a personal friend of William Makepeace Thackeray. When I say that he was the original co-author of A Christmas Carol, it is not nearly as outlandish as you might think it is. It's entirely to be expected, okay? It's not strange at all. And if you understood Mathew's wife, Abby, and her ability as a child prodigy, you'd understand that it's not at all unlikely that she could be the other co-author too, So I tried to keep to things that I have primary sources for. It's very frustrating to me. Nobody ever likes these. I think that one person was liking them for a while, and I suspect I know who that was. I think that might have been my researcher, and she may have stopped watching for a while and gotten busy, and now nobody ever likes these videos. So I'm speaking to people who don't like me, and technically, and I'm speaking to, at the most, maybe 17 people, in the whole world. I've discovered the real authors of A Christmas Carol, and I can only get 17 people to watch these videos where I'm providing the actual physical evidence from primary sources, okay, as much as I possibly can. It's bizarre, and I've got the evidence, good evidence, and it's in my papers. You just have to read them. In my books, you just have to read them. So, I do get terribly frustrated at times and angry sometimes. And I go through phases. And right now I'm kind of in a philosophical phase. I really didn't want to do this entry. I really would like to not do any more entries at all, pardon myself. But I feel like I need to, I'll just keep putting it out there and putting it out there and putting it out there until somebody starts taking it seriously.